Second was the wisdom literature, and third was the prophetic books. We're about ready to continue our survey of the historical books. We chose to look at Genesis chapters 1 and 2 very closely, in part because I wanted to raise those issues which you brought up, the question of inspiration, inerrancy, historicity, and so on. But now we need to survey more quickly because we've only got 3 meetings after this. So we're going to be moving much more fast and not reading specific texts in that detail, which we looked at the first 2 chapters. So tonight we're going to survey the history books in the Old Testament. And if you have with you the outline of the Old Testament that was passed out last time, which lists all of the books in canonical order, historical books, wisdom literature, prophetic books, you may wish, as we go through, to note where in the historical books can a given event be found. For example, the conquest or the Babylonian exile or whatever. I'll try and remember to mention where in the historical books various events can be found. But our purpose for the remainder of this evening is simply to give ourselves a knowledge of ancient Israelite history. What happened during Old Testament period? What were the crucial events that the people who produced the Old Testament went through? We need to have this chronological framework in our minds, because once we have established that chronological framework, then from now on, as we talk about the literature, we can refer to, if this was written here, what crucial event had just happened previously that would have influenced that writing, and that sort of thing. So we need the chronological framework in order for us to survey the historical books in the remaining 3 sessions. The handout I've given you provides approximately a brief paragraph explanation of each episode, but I've got roughly a dozen or so dates in Old Testament history which I consider to be the most crucial events of the period. I'm just going to talk our way through them. You may prefer to listen and read the paragraph descriptions afterward, or read those as I talk as you wish. But that is provided primarily for future reference, and also to save your fingers so you have to jot everything down real fast while I'm talking here tonight. When was the universe created according to modern science? Oh, God, you guys are good. 15 billion years ago, yeah. When was it created according to the Old Testament? Well, in 17-something, I don't remember exactly when it was, late 1700s, there was an archbishop of Dublin named James Ussher. And he decided to determine exactly when the universe was created. Of course, nobody had any idea that it extended as far back as 50 billion back then. So he carefully went through the Bible and scraped out every tiniest reference to the passage of time. And then he started with Jesus' birth and worked backward through every single reference in the Old Testament until he established exactly when creation was. Lo and behold, creation was exactly in the year 4004. And this got reprinted in hundreds of Bibles, editions of Bibles, over the next couple of centuries. You can still find Bibles put out today, which will say creation was in 4004, based upon this assessment that was done by the Archbishop of Dublin in the late 1700s. At any rate, the Bible begins with creation. We already know the account of creation. You have the creation of the universe, you have the creation of the first man, the first woman. Immediately after the creation of Adam and Eve, you have the story of the fall. This occurs in Genesis chapter 3. The fall narrative is the story of Adam, Eve, and the snake. You'll recall that the snake says to the woman, "Why can't you bite from the fruit?" The woman says, "Why?" and so on and so on. You realize I just made reference to a talking snake, and I know you see those pet items. Kind of seem a little strange. I suspect we have fiction here, but telling important truths nevertheless. You have the fall narrative telling one especially important truth, namely original sin is ultimately based on that narrative. Following that, you have the story of Cain and Abel. Abel does a sacrifice accepted by God. Cain does one unaccepted by God. Cain therefore kills Abel, and you have homicide entering human history. Then you get the story of Lamech, not very well known. Lamech said to his wives, if Cain killed Abel because his sacrifice was less acceptable, I'm going to kill somebody if they so much as look at me cross-eyed. If Cain killed 7 times, I will kill 70 times 7 times. I think that's one reason why Jesus says he was forgiven 70 times 7 times. He referred back to Lamech. So he didn't forgive anything. Then you get the story of the flood. Noah and the flood, the ark and the angels, the ark and the animals. At the end of which there is the covenant between God and Noah, and the rainbow is the sign of the covenant. Finally, in these first 11 chapters, the ones that I call quasi-mythical, is the story of the Tower of Babel. According to this story, this is Genesis 11, verses 1 to 11, humans decided to usurp God's place by building a tower that would lift them as high as God. God, of course, destroys their pride by destroying the tower, and they're dispersed, and languages divide from that point. All of these early chapters, and Genesis chapters 1 through 11, are usually referred to by scholars as the primitive history. Are not really datable, because despite efforts of archaeologists to find the ark and all this sort of thing, the degree to which events in these stories are historical or not is an open question. Where we feel that we are finally on firm historical ground, however, is with Genesis chapter 12. And Genesis chapter 12 is where there is mention made of Abraham. Essentially, what has been demonstrated, the important theological point that is made in Genesis 1 to 11, is that God created humankind very good. And we, through our own free will, chose evil. And we became progressively evil. First, there's disobedience in the garden. Then there's homicide. Then there's evil so drastic that the entire human race has to be erased, except for Noah and his family. And finally, you have the outrageous pride of the Tower of Babel. So the point, the theological point being made in those first 11 chapters is that we humans are no longer in the state that God intended us to be in. We are sinful. Right at Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, there is a change. And instead of humankind continuing to devolve and become worse and worse and worse, God intervenes. God intervenes in Genesis 12, 1 to 3, by making 3 promises to Abraham. If you have your Bible, take a look at this passage. It's very important for the structure of the Bible as a whole. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. Yahweh said to Abram, that's just an earlier form of the name Abraham, leave your country, your family, and your father's house for the land I will show you. So the first promise is land. God promises to Abraham, who's living over in Mesopotamia, near Babylon, that if he will pull up stakes and go trust God and go where God says, he will receive land. Secondly, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name so famous that it will be used as a blessing. So second, there is a promise that the nation of Israel will be a great nation. Third and last, and all the families of the earth will receive blessing through you. If the second verse refers to the Israelites becoming a great nation, then probably this third verse is referring to peoples other than the Israelites. The non-Israelites will receive blessing through you and your progeny, through the great nation that I will make you. If that's true, then what this is a promise of blessing to the Gentiles. Gentile simply means non-Jew. So we have these three promises made to Abraham right here, where the pivot point in the plot of the Bible occurs, very early in the Bible. When are these promises fulfilled? Well, Abraham does in fact pull up stakes, go to the promised land, and God gives him a very huge ranch, which he then is in charge of until he dies, then his son takes over. That son dies, etc. But there comes a time when the Israelites all wind up in Egypt, and they've lost the land. So probably, my assumption is, the giving of the land referred to here is after the exile, when Moses has led the Israelites back to the promised land, and then they go in and conquer it, and it remains theirs for centuries. That's probably the giving of the land that's being referred to. When was Israel a great nation? Certainly not when it was in Egypt and enslaved. Probably not when it first conquered the Holy Land, because they were still pretty barbaric tribes. My guess, probably what's being referred to here is under David. Because David was the great king who caused Israel to be one of the great nations of the ancient Near East. It was under him that Israel was a power to be reckoned with, like Mesopotamia or like Egypt, which were the perpetual superpowers of the ancient world. So these two promises get fulfilled within the Old Testament. But what about the blessing to the Gentiles? When does that occur? When does it happen that because of the existence of the Jewish people, we non-Jews wind up blessed? Through Jesus. That's my assumption as well. In fact, our assumption is the same assumption that the early Christians made, that third promise was fulfilled in Christ. Paul in Galatians chapter 3 quotes Genesis 12 when he says, Galatians 3:16, the promises were addressed to Abraham and to his descendants. My point is this: once God had expressed his will in due form, no law that came 430 years later could cancel that. He's making an argument that God's promise that blessing would flow upon the Gentiles is not interrupted because later on God gave the Mosaic law. But at any rate, he interprets this blessing of the Gentiles to have occurred through Christ. There's a couple other places in the New Testament where that same interpretation is made. At any rate, God intervenes and begins a specific plan of salvation for humanity. He had a plan to begin with. Humans opted against him, devolved, so to speak. He intervenes with a new plan. And from then on, the plot of the Bible, so to speak, is largely a matter of the working out of these, with the conquest of the Holy Land, with the Davidic monarchy, with the coming of Christ. However, there are innumerable obstacles that occur on the way toward the fulfillment of these promises. A lot of the episodes and incidents in the early part of the Bible have to do with these obstacles. For example, Abraham had a wife named an obstacle to the fulfillment of the promise. Another example, Abraham finally has 2 kids, but the older one, the one who comes out first, is Esau. And God intends for the great nation to come to the second child, so that Esau has the right of primogeniture. He's to receive the inheritance. We have all of these obstacles occurring. Of course, the big obstacle was the enslavement in Egypt. At any rate, from Genesis 12 on, we have the stories of the patriarchs. Patriarch is a word made out of 2 Greek words. Patri is from pater, which means father, and arch is from archos, which means first or source. So the first fathers. These are the stories of the first fathers. And there are precisely 15 of these first fathers. The first of them is Abraham. Abraham has a wife, Sarah. Sarah gives birth to Isaac and Ishmael, right? Yeah, Ishmael. I misspoke a moment ago. Esau is the son of Isaac, the other of whom is Jacob. Just go blank there for a moment. Abraham and Sarah have these 2. Isaac winds up inheriting the ranch. Isaac marries Rebekah. They have Esau and Jacob. Jacob winds up inheriting the ranch. Jacob, although he had more than one wife, as his primary wife had Rachel. He wound up having 12 sons, not to mention a few daughters. These 12 sons of Jacob are each of them an ancestor of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. So, if we have the names of the 12 sons of Jacob, we've automatically got the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. Let me see how far I can get. I doubt I can do them all. Judah. Oh, they're on the handout?
Yeah.
Oh, let me just try and see what I can do. Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Levi, famous for 501s. Benjamin, I don't have. Joseph, of course. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Not so good. Did I say Reuben here? Okay, there's Reuben. Dan. Who did I forget? Simeon, yeah, good. Twelve sons are born to Jacob. By the way, at one point in his life, God gave Jacob a nickname, and that nickname was Israel. Israel means wrestler with God, one who wrestles with God. You'll recall that story where during the middle of the night somebody attacks him, he wrestles till dawn. This mysterious figure leaves. As he leaves, this fellow turns out to be God, or an angel. The narrative is ambiguous. Renames him Israel. So consequently, these are the sons of Israel, and the nations that descend from them are the sons of Israel, ultimately. The 11 brothers don't like Joseph. Consequently, they sell him to a passing caravan, which who no longer likes the Jews, the Hebrews. Consequently, they have all wound up being enslaved. So with the second book of the Bible, Exodus, we start getting the stories of rushes, puts it out. Pharaoh's daughter retrieves it, adopts him. Moses is raised with his actual mother as his nurse. Consequently, she probably told him his actual heritage all along. He is raised as Pharaoh's son. When he becomes a grown man, he's out in his chariot one day, sees one of these Egyptian overseers wickedly beating a Hebrew slave, and goes over and slugs the guy, kills him accidentally. But he buries the guy under some sand, presuming nobody has seen. The following day, he intervenes between a couple of Egyptians who are fighting. One of them says, "What are you going to do? Kill me like you killed that guy yesterday?" And suddenly Moses realizes, I got to get the heck out of town because Grandpa is going to find out that I'm not really Egyptian. So he leaves. He leaves Egypt, and he comes over to, here's the Sinai Peninsula, sticking down the Red Sea. He comes over to the land of Midian, right about here, the northern part of the peninsula. While there, he sees this beautiful woman watering her sheep. He winds up being a shepherd for her father, winds up marrying her. Her name is Zipporah. And while out shepherding his sheep one day, on the side of a hill, he sees a bush, which is, although it's a plain, it is not being burned out. He goes over to the bush and says, "Who are you?" And a voice comes out of the bush and says, "Take off your shoes, for I am gentleman." He said, "Take off your shoes, for the land on which you stand is holy." Moses takes off his sandals, repeats the question, "Who are you?" And Yahweh says, "I am Yahweh." According to the narrative, this is the first time that Yahweh has revealed his name to be Yahweh. Of course, we already saw that it gets used earlier, like chapter 2 of Genesis. But according to this particular source of the narrative, this is the point at which Yahweh revealed his name. In Hebrew, remember they don't use consonants, or they don't use vowels, they just got consonants? It looks like this. This is Y-H-W-H. Consequently, this name became known as the Tetragrammaton. Gramma means letter, tetra means four, those are both Greek words. So the four letters. This was considered so holy a name that by Jesus' time, no Jew would say that name any longer. No one ever said the name Yahweh. Instead, if you were reading along at a Sabbath service on a Saturday morning, let's say, and I'm the rabbi doing the reading, and I come to the name Yahweh, I won't say Yahweh, I'll say the word for Lord instead, which is Adonai, A-D-O-N-A-I. Well, when the Bible was translated into English in the King James Version in 1611, they wanted to show respect for God by not using the name Yahweh. What they chose to do was to use the name Yahweh, but instead stick in vowels from the name Adonai, which is traditionally used by Jews instead of Yahweh. So if you put those in, you get Yehovah. And that's where the name Jehovah comes from. God never called himself Jehovah. This is a name that was made up by English speakers as a way of also not using the name Yahweh. Even today, Jews will not use a direct reference to God. I had a Jewish girl in my class a couple of years ago. And whenever in her research paper she wanted to refer to God, instead of typing capital G-O-D, she typed capital G-D. Will not say the name God, ever. At any rate, at the burning bush, God reveals that his name is Yahweh. Nobody is absolutely sure what that name means anymore. But the most probable guess by scholars is that the root of it is from the verb to be in Hebrew. So that's why you get translations like, tell them I am that I am sent you. Tell them I am sent you. You can look at that in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, where you get this explanation of the name. Some scholars have hypothesized that what God was asserting here was that he exists in a way that nothing else exists. He exists with a kind of preeminent existence over everything else. And isn't that true? God provides his own existence. There is no God prior to God who holds God in existence, who provides God with his existence. God holds himself in existence. That's an incredible thought when you think about it. As opposed to everything else. These rafters, this cup of coffee, me. I don't provide myself existence. God is holding me in existence right now. And if for 1 second he were to withdraw his will that I exist, he'd be looking at the blackboard, not at me. So everything derives its existence from God except God. God is his own source of existence. He is not dependent upon anything else. Perhaps that was the insight that was trying to be communicated by this name. We don't know for sure, but some scholars have suggested that that use of the root to be may have meant something like that. At any rate, God reveals himself to be Yahweh, and he says, I am the God of your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. I want you to return to Egypt and lead my people out of captivity to a land that I will show them. Moses says, I don't speak so good. Can I invite my brother Aaron to go along? As far as... So Aaron and Moses go back over to Egypt, to the court of the Pharaoh. There they declare to Pharaoh that God wants him to release the Israelites. Pharaoh says, yeah, right. Then Moses throws down his staff, it becomes a snake. Pharaoh's magicians throw down their staff, they become snakes that eat. No, it's vice versa. Moses' snake eats the Pharaoh's magician's snake. And the line has been drawn. We now get the 10 plagues. There are 10 plagues of Egypt that occur at this point in the narrative. Who can remember what these are? Yeah.
Darkness, river, water, blood, frogs, locusts. Did I say darkness already?
What? Gnats or mosquitoes, some people translate it. Boils all over the body, yeah. A plague on the animals, so the livestock dies off. I think that is true, right? The crops die off. There's 2 left. Of course, the ultimate one is going to be death of the firstborn. But we're only hail. I believe it's also, yeah. Oh, hail. That's the one you forgot. These 10 plagues occur. Each time one of the plagues occurs, Moses is slightly more willing to give in, but then he hardens his heart and refuses to do so. Finally, you have the death of the firstborn. And God warns the Israelites through Moses ahead of time that the angel of death will be passing through the streets of the cities of Egypt, killing the firstborn son, both of men and of animals, and that therefore the Israelites should sacrifice lambs, take the blood, use a sprig of hyssop, and slap the blood on the lintel and the door jambs of their houses. Then the angel will pass over these houses and go on to the Egyptian's house. This is one of the derivations, the us with the name Passover in the Bible. At any rate, this is the beginning of Passover. Passover from then on is going to be a celebration of this event in Israelite history of the Exodus from Egypt. The following morning, Pharaoh is sitting on the throne with his dead son, the man who was to become Pharaoh after him, in his arms, and he says, "Go." Of course, I'm elaborating this a little bit, but I saw the movie, right? So I know this happened. And so the Israelites grab everything and get the heck out of there. One of the things that they in their rush, failed to bring with them was yeast. Consequently, that's why every year at Passover we eat unleavened bread, not leavened bread. The Israelites take off for the wilderness where Moses had seen Yahweh. We're told that they reached the Red Sea. God parted the waters. They went through dry shod. When the Egyptian army came along behind them, the waters collapsed and destroyed the army. However, the Red Sea is down here. If we assume that it's the Red Sea, that would mean that the Israelites crossed here, probably, somewhere like that. However, a lot of early manuscripts do not say Red Sea. They say Reed Sea, R-E-E-D. And nobody's quite sure where that would be. But here we've got the Nile Delta, which is extremely marshy, where there's lots of reeds. And one would expect that they would have traversed it in the beginning of their flight. So a lot of scholars would opt for a northern route and would say they came this way. Either way, they crossed, the Egyptians were destroyed behind them, and they are now suddenly engaged in their wilderness wanderings. The wilderness wanderings occur in two stages. First, there are the wanderings that occur between Egypt and Mount Sinai, where Moses first brings the Israelites. Then, after they stay at Mount Sinai for a considerable time, the Israelites leave Mount Sinai and come up to the Holy Land. That, too, is part of the wilderness wanderings. The rounded off period for the wilderness wanderings is, in the Bible, referred to as 40 years. In the midst of the wilderness wanderings, they reach Mount Sinai. Moses goes up on the Mount Sinai and receives the tablet of the Ten Commandments. He comes down, discovers that Aaron, his sister Miriam, all of the Israelites have created the golden calf and are worshiping it. He destroys the Ten Commandments, pounds the golden calf into gold dust, sprinkles it in thousands of glasses of water, and makes them all drink it. Then the next day he goes back up the mountain and gets another copy of the Ten Commandments. Brings that down. They do not, however, leave Mount Sinai at this point. Rather, they stay. He goes up the next day, gets some more laws, comes down, goes up the next day, gets some more laws, comes down, goes up the next day. For a couple of months, Moses is going up and down the mountain. I counted one time, I think I said 17 times Moses goes up and down the mountain, collecting laws from God. And these laws are all presently to be found in the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But they are mostly to be found in the second half of second half of Exodus, all of Leviticus, first half of Numbers, and in the early part of the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapters 1 to 30. And that's roughly half of the Pentateuch, is these laws that Moses received from God on Mount Sinai. The other half of the Pentateuch is the stories that we've been talking about. Abraham, Adam, etc. So about half of the first 5 books are narratives and half of them are laws. That's why the Jews refer to the first 5 books as the law. They are much more interested in the laws than they are in the stories. We Christians, since we no longer feel bound by the Mosaic law, are approach. The Holy Land. The Holy Land has the Mediterranean as its western border, and on the east has three bodies of water: Sea of Galilee in the north, from whence flows the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea in the south, into which the Jordan River flows. So that forms a kind of a natural eastern boundary for the Holy Land back at this time. The Israelites, Moses leads the Israelites right up to the eastbound bank of the Jordan River and is ready to cross when he dies. And the death of Moses, if you want to mark it there on your outline of the Bible, is the very last item in the book of Deuteronomy. We saw that the captivity of the Israelites begins in the first page of Exodus, and right there you get the narrative of Moses' birth, and the death of Moses is at the end of Deuteronomy. So 4 out of the first 5 books is all focused on Moses. That's because so half of these books is all that legal stuff. Zoning, pork, all those other things. Thus ends the Pentateuch or the Torah. We have a few more dates to go through here, but I don't want to keep you too long. We're supposed to go to 9:30 and it's 9:30. Marguerite's back in the nodding yet. That's right, Dr. Hahn. You shut up. So, could you be sure to bring these back next time, and we'll finish off this history, and then we'll start looking at some of the historical books. Thanks very much.